At Mabel's diner, Frank Wallace, a decorated veteran, faces scorn for his modest presence. Mocked by college kids, dismissed by a boastful lumberyard owner, and snapped at by waitress Julie, Frank's quiet dignity hides a heroic past. 28 years of service, 2 Purple Hearts, and lives saved under fire. As he's humiliated and asked to leave, a military jeep pulls up. A young soldier in dress blues steps out, his presence silencing the diner. Who is he, and why does his arrival stop the laughter? The truth about Frank's sacrifices is about to unravel, promising a reckoning that will change everything. Share this tale to celebrate courage and respect for veterans. Type honor below and name a veteran who deserves recognition. Be the voice that stands up. Join us to ensure no hero's sacrifice is forgotten. On a bright, chilly Saturday morning in North Creek, Mabel's diner pulsed with the familiar energy of a small-town hub. The aroma of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee filled the air, blending with the faint draft that sneaked in whenever the door opened. Workers in worn flannel shirts shoveled eggs and toast, preparing for long shifts at the factory. Truckers, their faces etched with the exhaustion of endless roads, sipped coffee that had gone cold, their thoughts drifting to miles yet to cover. A group of high schoolers squeezed into a booth, laughed over a towering stack of pancakes, their chatter a lively mix of rumors and weekend plans. Amid this bustling scene, tucked into a corner booth by a window clouded with age, sat Frank Wallace, a 72-year-old man whose quiet presence seemed to blend into the diner's faded charm. Frank's slight frame was wrapped in an old army jacket, its once vibrant green now dulled, the threads unraveling at the edges like the memories he clung to. His silver hair, though thinning, was carefully combed, a small act of pride in a life marked by humility. In his hands, gnarled by time and toil, he held a worn army cap, treating it with the reverence one might reserve for a holy artifact. To Frank, it was more than fabric. It was a witness to his 28 years of service, from the humid chaos of Vietnam to the scorching sands of Iraq and the jagged peaks of Afghanistan. That cap had seen him earn 2 Purple Hearts, each scar a story of survival, and a Bronze Star for bravery when fear gripped others. But here in Mabel's, it was just an old cap, held by an old man who ordered 1 black coffee each Saturday, the cheapest thing he could buy. Frank's weekly visits were a ritual, a quiet anchor in a life that felt adrift. He'd settle into the booth, the vinyl creaking under his weight, and stare out the window at North Creek stirring to life. From his pocket, he'd draw a silver dollar, a gift from his late wife, Mary, before his first tour. Its edges were smoothed from years of handling, a tactile prayer he turned over in his fingers as he sipped his coffee. The coin caught the morning light, sparking memories of Mary's voice, soft and certain. "I'll wait for you, no matter how long." Sometimes his gaze would linger on the diner's walls, where faded photos of families smiled down, parents with children, couples in love, moments captured in time. They tugged at his heart, pulling him back to his own home, once alive with Mary's laughter and David's childhood antics. Now the house was a hollow shell, Mary gone 5 years to cancer, David halfway across the world, serving his own tour. The silence there was deafening, so Frank came to Mabel's, seeking the hum of human presence, even if it came with indifference. To the regulars, Frank was barely more than scenery. Some didn't notice him at all, their eyes passing over him like he was part of the booth itself. Others muttered under their breath, their words laced with disdain. "That old guy's back," one would say, rolling their eyes. "Bet he's just mooching off welfare," a teenager sneered, his friends snickering over their syrup-soaked plates. The comments cut deeper than Frank let on, but his face never betrayed the ache. He'd seen too much, heard the scream of shells, carried the weight of fallen comrades, to flinch at petty cruelty. Instead, he'd turn his coin, sip his coffee, and let the memories of Mary's warmth hold him steady. He never spoke of the nights he woke, heart pounding, hearing echoes of war. He never mentioned the friends he'd buried or the lives he'd saved. He simply sat, a quiet sentinel in a world that had moved on. Julie, the head waitress, was fraying at the edges that morning. Extra shifts had left her bone-tired, her patience worn to a thread by entitled customers and meager tips. Every spilled drink, every demand for faster service, chipped away at her composure. When she reached Frank's booth, her frustration found a target. "You ordering anything besides that coffee today, or what?" she barked, slamming the menu down with enough force to rattle the table. Her voice carried, sharp and cold, turning heads across the diner. Frank met her gaze with a gentle smile, the kind born from years of facing hardship without breaking. It wasn't defiance but endurance, a quiet strength forged in fire. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the silver dollar, and held it up, letting it gleam in the sunlight. To him, it was more than a coin. It was Mary's love, a talisman against the world's indifference. The diner's crowd reacted with a mix of apathy and cruelty. Laughter rippled from a nearby table, sharp and mocking. A piece of toast hit the floor near Frank's booth. Whether by carelessness or malice, no one could say. Frank bent down, his movements slow with age, and picked it up, setting it carefully on the table's edge. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of his dignity, a refusal to let the world's disregard diminish him. Beneath his unassuming exterior was a story no one in the diner could guess, a tale of a staff sergeant who had led men through hell, who had risked everything to protect the freedoms these people took for granted as they grumbled about cold food or slow service. Then the diner's rhythm faltered. The door swung open and a young man in a pristine military uniform stepped inside, his face a mask of calm resolve. The laughter at the nearby table died, the air growing heavy with curiosity. His boots clicked against the floor as he crossed the room, stopping beside Frank's booth. Frank looked up, and for a moment time seemed to pause. It was David, his son, home from deployment, standing tall in the uniform that carried echoes of Frank's own past. Their eyes met, a silent exchange of pride, pain, and unspoken love. In that instant, the diner's noise faded, and Frank's hands tightened around his cap, holding on to the weight of a life no one else in the room could truly understand. Frank Wallace sat alone in a cracked vinyl booth at Mabel's diner, his weathered hands cradling a chipped coffee mug as though it were a lifeline. The faint, rhythmic clink of a worn lucky coin flipping between his knuckles was a private ritual, a tether to a past he rarely spoke of. At 68, Frank had mastered the art of fading into the background, his faded flannel shirt and gray hair blending seamlessly with the diner's dated decor. Yet beneath his quiet exterior simmered a reservoir of memories, some so heroic they could stop a heart, others so painful they kept him awake at night. He set the empty mug down with a care that bordered on reverence, as if it held more than just the dregs of cheap coffee. Outside, a military jeep rolled into the parking lot, its engine a low growl against the crunch of gravel. But inside, the diner's patrons were too wrapped up in their own lives to sense the change looming on the horizon, a moment that would soon strip away Frank's cloak of invisibility. Frank's life was a tapestry of unspoken sacrifices. In his youth, he had crawled through the chaos of Afghanistan's battlefields, dragging wounded soldiers to safety as bullets tore through the air. He had volunteered for missions that made even hardened men blanch, driven by a quiet resolve. Never expect others to risk what you wouldn't face yourself. The dog tags hidden beneath his shirt carried the weight of those days, days of courage that could bring tears to the eyes of anyone who heard them. But Frank had learned that a true heroism, unseen by the world, often went unnoticed, like a star obscured by city lights. When the wars ended, he returned to North Creek, trading combat boots for a mechanic's wrench. For 3 decades, his grease-stained hands coaxed life back into broken engines, never once revealing that those same hands had saved 17 souls in a single blood-soaked night. His small home was a shrine to simplicity, adorned with photographs of Mary, his late wife, whose smile still anchored him. His Purple Heart and military commendations lay untouched in a drawer, relics of a life he no longer claimed. Each night he whispered to her picture, his voice cracking with grief. "I kept my promise, Mary. I came back. But promises don't ease the emptiness." The solitude was a burden he bore silently, heavier than any load he'd carried in war. This Saturday morning at Mabel's, Frank's understated dignity was about to be tested in ways no enemy fire ever had. The diner's door swung open, admitting a group of college students whose raucous laughter shattered the morning's calm. Their eyes quickly found Frank, his solitude and worn army cap marking him as an easy target for their amusement. "Hey, Grandpa," one shouted, his voice thick with mockery. "Got any war stories? Bet they're real wild." His friends laughed, their taunts fueled by the arrogance of youth untested by life's cruelties. Frank offered a polite smile, his fingers pausing on the lucky coin. But inside, a familiar weariness took root. How many times had he faced this dismissal, this assumption that his silence meant he had nothing worth saying? "What's wrong, old man?" another student jeered, leaning forward with a grin. "Too shy? Or maybe you never saw any action?" The words cut, not because they were true, but because they were so carelessly cruel, thrown out by kids who'd never known the price of freedom. At a nearby table, a middle-aged woman with two children cast a glance at Frank, her face a mix of sympathy and unease. She drew her kids closer, her voice carrying in a stage whisper. "Don't stare, sweetie. Some people are different, probably has troubles." Her husband nodded, his tone authoritative. "Yeah, one of those veterans who can't adjust. You see him on the news, homeless, drifting." Their words, though not meant to harm, landed like blows, each one chipping away at Frank's carefully constructed armor. He kept his eyes on his mug, but his heart ached with the sting of being judged, of being reduced to a stereotype by people who didn't know the battles he'd fought, both overseas and within himself. Julie, the waitress, was battling her own demons. Her car was dead, her rent was late, and her hours had been cut, leaving her on edge. When she saw Frank still lingering over his single coffee after nearly an hour, her frustration boiled over. She marched to his booth, her voice sharp. "Look, if you're not ordering food, I need this booth for customers who actually pay." Frank met her gaze, his eyes tired but gentle, the eyes of a man who'd faced far greater threats than an angry waitress. "I understand," he said softly. "I can move it to the counter if that's for folks eating breakfast." Julie cut him off, her patience gone. "This is a business, not a shelter." The words struck Frank like a slap, each syllable a reminder of how the world now saw him, not as a hero but as a nuisance, a homeless shelter, from a woman young enough to be his granddaughter, serving coffee in a country he'd nearly died for. His hands shook as he reached for his wallet. "I have money," he said, his voice steady despite the hurt. "I can order something else." Julie's eyes narrowed, her doubt clear. "How much money?" she demanded. Frank opened his wallet, revealing 70-30 stacks, enough for coffee and perhaps toast, but not enough to meet her definition of a real customer. He felt her judgment like a physical weight, the unspoken assumption that he was less than the others who filled her tables. At the next booth, an older man, the local lumberyard owner, decided to add his voice, his words booming across the diner. "You know what gets me about guys like him?" he said, pointing at Frank. "They talk about serving their country, but what have they actually done for society? Look at him, just sitting there." Frank's fingers tightened on his army cap, the familiar fabric grounding him as the man's words twisted his life into something small and unworthy. "I serve too," the lumberyard owner continued, his tone smug. "But you don't see me begging for handouts or expecting special treatment. Real veterans make something of themselves." A few customers nodded, their faces reflecting agreement or apathy. Others looked uneasy, their eyes avoiding Frank's, unwilling to confront the growing tension. A teenager nearby pulled out his phone, its camera capturing the scene, the red light a silent witness to the storm brewing in the diner. Frank sat motionless, his heart pounding not with rage, but with a profound, aching sorrow. He had faced death without flinching. But these small, thoughtless cruelties from his own community cut deeper than any wound he had ever sustained. The rain fell in a gentle, unrelenting veil, casting the world in shades of gray as Frank Wallace stood beneath the awning of the small-town diner, his calloused hands pressing his army cap tightly against his chest. The sting of shame seared through him, a quiet fire that threatened to unravel the dignity he'd clung to through years of hardship. The laughter from inside the diner still echoed in his mind, harsh, biting, and utterly devoid of kindness. It wasn't the laughter of camaraderie or shared joy. It was the cruel, hollow kind that feeds on another's pain, exposing a man's vulnerabilities to a room full of strangers who knew nothing of his life's battles. For a fleeting moment, His broad shoulders, forged by decades of service, slumped under the weight of their mockery, as if the world itself had grown too heavy to bear. Frank's fingers brushed the worn fabric of his cap, tracing the faded emblem that symbolized a lifetime of sacrifice. He'd left $2 on the table, more than enough for the untouched coffee that had cooled in his cup, a small act of defiance against the humiliation that had driven him from his seat. His voice had remained steady as he spoke to Julie, the waitress, her eyes darting away with a mix of sympathy and discomfort. "Thank you for the coffee," he'd said, each word a shield against the turmoil roiling inside him. "I apologize for any inconvenience." But the teenager's jeer had chased him to the door. "Hey, old man, smile for the camera. You're going to be famous." The words cut deeper than any wound he'd sustained in combat, and the wave of laughter that followed was like a physical blow, leaving him raw and exposed. He'd paused at the door, his hand gripping the handle, a part of him yearning to turn back and to reclaim his dignity with words he couldn't find. But what could he say to people who saw him as nothing more than a fleeting moment of entertainment? Now, standing in the drizzle, Frank felt smaller than he had in years, as if the world had shrunk him down to a shadow of the man he'd once been. The town he'd returned to after his service had grown unfamiliar, its pulse quickened by technology and indifference, leaving him stranded in a life that no longer seemed to fit. He was ready to walk away, to slip back into the solitude that had become his refuge, when the sound of footsteps pierced the soft rhythm of the rain. They were heavy, purposeful, unmistakably military, a cadence that stirred memories of drills and brotherhood. Frank turned slowly, his breath hitching, as his gaze settled on the figure emerging from the mist. There, framed by the diner's neon glow, stood a young man in dress blues, the uniform so immaculate it seemed untouched by the rain. The jacket's sharp lines, the gleam of polished brass, the rows of ribbons and medals arranged with precision, all marked him as a soldier of distinction. But it wasn't the uniform that sent a tremor through Frank's frame. It was the face beneath the cap, the face etched into his heart through years of love and pride, the face of the child he'd cradled, the boy he'd taught to ride a bike, the young man he'd watched graduate with tears in his eyes. "David," Frank whispered, his voice fragile, as if the moment might dissolve if he spoke too loudly. Lieutenant David Wallace, 28 and newly returned from a classified mission, stood at attention, his salute so crisp it seemed to slice through the air. His eyes, tempered by the trials of war, softened with the love of a son reunited with his father. "Staff Sergeant Frank Wallace," David said, his voice resonant with authority yet warm with affection. "Permission to join you, sir?" Tears brimmed in Frank's eyes, spilling over despite his efforts to hold them back. "Son," he managed, his voice thick with emotion, "what are you doing here?" David's jaw tightened, a spark of anger flickering beneath his composure. "I came home to surprise you, Dad, but it looks like I arrived just in time." From the parking lot, he'd glimpsed enough through the diner's windows to understand the scene that had unfolded. His father, the man who had instilled in him the values of honor, resilience, and service, had been mocked by people who couldn't fathom the weight of his sacrifices. The injustice of it fueled a quiet fury in David, a resolve to set things right. "Dad," he said, his tone firm with determination, "I think it's time these people learned who you really are." Before Frank could object, David turned toward the diner's entrance, his stride confident and unyielding, the bearing of a man accustomed to leading through chaos. Frank followed, his cap still clutched tightly, his heart a storm of emotions. Pride in his son, apprehension for what was to come, and a flicker of hope he scarcely dared to acknowledge. What did David intend to do? The boy he'd raised was now a force in his own right, and Frank found himself torn between awe and uncertainty. As David pushed through the diner's door, the room fell into a stunned silence. Conversations died mid-word, utensils clattered against plates, and every gaze locked onto the soldier in dress blues. His presence was commanding, not merely because of the uniform, but because of the quiet strength he carried, a strength forged in the crucible of danger. His ribbon spoke of bravery under fire, of missions that tested the limits of human endurance. The teenager, still holding his phone, shrank under David's unwavering stare, his earlier arrogance evaporating. Julie, behind the counter, gripped a rag tightly, her breath shallow as she sensed the gravity of the moment. The air crackled with anticipation, as if the diner itself were holding its breath, waiting for the reckoning that had just walked through the door. The air in the diner felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that seemed to ripple outward from the young soldier standing in the doorway. His presence alone commanded attention, a quiet intensity radiating from him that silenced the room. The college students, who moments ago had been snickering and tossing careless jabs at the older man in the corner, suddenly found their phones far more fascinating than their own bravado. Their fingers scrolled aimlessly, avoiding the piercing gaze of the soldier whose eyes swept the room with deliberate precision. Julie, the waitress, paused mid-swipe as she cleaned a table, her cloth frozen in her hand. Something about the young man's expression, calm yet unyielding, sent a chill through her, knotting her stomach with a mix of guilt and unease. She'd seen that look before, though never so raw, never so commanding. It was the look of someone who had faced far worse than a diner full of careless words and mocking laughter. David, the soldier, stood tall, his posture rigid but not aggressive, his uniform crisp despite the faint wear of countless days in service. His eyes, sharp and steady, locked onto each person who had contributed to the scene unfolding before him. He saw the college kid with the phone, still trembling slightly from the weight of his own actions. He saw the lumberyard owner, whose earlier boasts of false military service now seemed to shrink him into his seat. And he saw his father, Frank, standing uncertainly in the doorway, clutching his worn army cap like a lifeline, his face etched with the quiet dignity of a man who had endured far more than this moment. When David spoke, his voice cut through the silence like a blade, calm, measured, but carrying the unmistakable weight of authority forged in places these people could scarcely imagine. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone steady but resonant, "I'd like you to meet someone." He gestured toward Frank, who shifted uncomfortably, his weathered hands tightening around the cap. "This is Staff Sergeant Frank Wallace, United States Army, 28 years of active service, 3 combat deployments, 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star with Valor, a combat infantry badge." Each word landed like a stone, sinking into the silence of the diner, which had grown so still it felt as though the world itself had paused to listen. David's voice grew stronger, infused with a passion born of pride and quiet fury. "This man has saved the lives of 47 soldiers under enemy fire. He has been wounded in service to this country more times than I can count. He has volunteered for missions that others, men braver than most, were too afraid to take." His gaze settled on the college kid, whose phone now shook visibly in his hands. The bravado drained from his face. David's words were not just a defense but a proclamation, a testament to a man whose sacrifices had gone unnoticed for far too long. "You thought it was funny to mock him? To record him like some sideshow for your amusement? Let me tell you who this man really is." He turned to the group of students, his eyes locking onto the one who had been filming. "In 2009, my father spent 3 days crawling through enemy territory, hostile, unforgiving land where every moment could have been his last. He did it to rescue 4 soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. He took 2 bullets to the leg, and still he refused to be evacuated until every single one of those men was safe." The kid's face flushed, his phone now a heavy burden in his hands, the screen dimming as his fingers faltered. David's voice didn't waver, but there was a tremor of emotion beneath it, a son's fierce love for his father. He didn't do it for glory. He didn't do it for a medal. He did it because it was right. Turning to the lumberyard owner, whose earlier claims of military service now hung like a lie exposed in the air, David's tone sharpened. "You said real veterans make something of themselves. Let me tell you about my father's life after the Army. For 30 years, he worked as a mechanic, using the same hands that pulled soldiers from the jaws of death to fix cars for the people in this town. He never asked for a pat on the back. He never demanded special treatment. He just showed up day after day, serving this community the same way he served his country, with quiet, unyielding dedication." The lumberyard owner's face had gone ashen, his earlier confidence crumbling under the weight of David's words. He stared at the table, unable to meet the young soldier's gaze. Julie, the waitress, took a tentative step forward, her earlier sharpness replaced by a quiet shame. She clutched her cleaning rag like a shield, her voice barely above a whisper. Sir, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Her words were fragile, tinged with regret, as if she could feel the weight of every careless remark she'd made. David's expression softened, but only slightly, his eyes still burning with purpose. Ma'am, he said, his voice gentler now. My father comes here every Saturday morning. He orders 1 cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and sits in that corner over there. He pointed to the small table in the back, unassuming and tucked away. He doesn't bother anyone. He doesn't ask for anything. He comes here because, after my mother passed, this place, this diner, is the only place where he doesn't feel completely alone. Frank, who had been standing silently, his cap still in his hands, stepped forward. His face, weathered by years of service and loss, carried a quiet strength, but his eyes were soft with emotion. David, he said, his voice low and steady, placing a gentle hand on his son's arm. That's enough. But David shook his head, his jaw tight with resolve. No, Dad, it's not enough. These people need to understand who you are. They need to know what you've done. He turned back to the diner, addressing the entire room now, his voice rising with a conviction that seemed to fill the space. My father taught me that true honor doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't need applause or headlines. But that doesn't mean a man who has given everything, his body, his years, his heart, should be treated with disrespect. He reached into his wallet, pulling out a crisp $50 bill and placing it on the nearest table with a deliberate calm. This should cover my father's coffee for the next few months. And from now on, when Staff Sergeant Frank Wallace walks through that door, he's to be treated with the respect he's earned. Not just today, but every day. The silence that followed was profound, a collective holding of breath as the weight of David's words settled over the room. Then something extraordinary happened. An elderly man in the back, his hands trembling with age, rose slowly from his seat. Another followed, then another, until every person in the diner was standing, some with tears glistening in their eyes, others with heads bowed in quiet shame. The college kid who had been recording approached Frank, his phone clutched tightly in his hands. His voice was barely audible, quivering with emotion. Sir, he said, I'd like to delete this video, and maybe if it's okay, I'd like to record a new one, about real heroes, about you. Frank looked at his son, this fierce, proud young man who carried the best parts of him and his late wife, Mary. For the first time in years, Frank felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt since Mary's passing, a sense of being and truly seen. He stood a little taller, his shoulders squaring as he met David's gaze. Son, he said softly, his voice thick with pride, your mother would be so proud of the man you've become. David's lips curved into a smile, not one of triumph, but of quiet fulfillment, the smile of a son who had finally given his father the honor he deserved. She'd be proud of both of us, Dad, he replied, his voice steady but warm. And in that moment, as the diner stood in silent respect, father and son shared a bond forged not just in blood, but in sacrifice, love, and the unspoken understanding of what it means to serve. The sound of applause filled the air, not a forced or fleeting cheer, but a deep, resonant outpouring of gratitude that seemed to rise from the soul of every person present. Frank Wallace stood there, his chest tight with a mix of humility and astonishment. For so long, he had carried the weight of his service, quietly, unnoticed, uncelebrated, and yet unyielding in its significance. In that moment, he realized that sometimes heroes who fade into the background are finally pulled into the light. Sometimes the scales of justice tip not through grand gestures, but through the steadfast love of a son who refuses to let his father's quiet sacrifices slip into oblivion. David, standing beside him, had been the spark that ignited this change. A young man whose heart burned with pride for a father who had given so much and asked for so little. The transformation that swept through North Creek began the moment that applause faded, but its impact spread like wildfire, touching every corner of the small town. By the next morning, Mabel's diner, once a place where Frank had felt the sting of disrespect, had become a beacon of redemption. The owner, moved by the events of the previous day, had wasted no time in making a permanent statement. A polished wooden sign now hung beside the front door, its carved letters bold and unmistakable. Veterans welcome always. It was more than a gesture. It was a promise. a vow that this diner would be a haven for those who had served, a place where their stories would be honored rather than dismissed. For Frank, who had spent years feeling invisible, that sign felt like a quiet acknowledgement that his life, his choices, and his sacrifices mattered. But the change didn't stop there. Julie, the young waitress who had once humiliated Frank with her careless words, arrived at the diner early for her shift, her heart heavy with remorse. She clutched a handwritten letter, its pages filled with the weight of her regret. As Frank and David settled into their usual booth for breakfast, she approached their table, her steps hesitant, her eyes brimming with tears. Her voice trembled as she spoke, each word carrying the raw sincerity of someone desperate to make amends. "Mr. Wallace," she began, her hands shaking as she held the letter out to him. "I wrote this last night, but I need to say it to your face too. I was cruel to you, a man who deserves nothing but my respect. I'll carry that shame for the rest of my life." She set the letter on the table, her fingers lingering on it as if letting go was an act of surrender. "I've asked my manager to start something new here. A hero's breakfast, free coffee and a meal for any veteran, anytime. And I want it to be named after you, sir." Frank looked at her, his weathered face softening. He reached out and took her hand gently, his grip steady despite the years that had worn him down. "We all stumble, Julie," he said, his voice low but warm. "What matters is that you're trying to make it right. That's enough for me." Julie nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks, and for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope that she could forgive herself. Later that afternoon, the college students who had mocked Frank returned to the diner, their heads bowed not in defiance but in contrition. The young man who had once tried to capture Frank's humiliation on his phone now approached with a different purpose. His hand shook slightly as he held out his phone, his voice earnest. "Sir," he said, meeting Frank's gaze, "I made a new video. It's about real heroes, about how we should treat people like you. It's got over 1 million views already, and every single comment is about showing respect to veterans." Frank watched the video in silence, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. Not for himself, but for the change he saw in this young man's eyes. These kids, who had once laughed at him, now saw him as a living testament to courage and sacrifice. Their apology wasn't just words. It was a shift in their hearts, a promise to carry that lesson forward. The lumberyard owner, a man whose lies about his own military service had once deepened Frank's pain, couldn't stay away either. That same day he closed his business early and walked into Mabel's diner, his face flushed with shame. In front of the bustling lunch crowd, he stood up, his voice cracking as he addressed Frank directly. "I lied about serving," he admitted, his words heavy with self-loathing. "I've never worn a uniform, never risked anything for anyone. You have every right to hate me, Mr. Wallace." The room fell silent, every eye on Frank, waiting for his response. Frank looked at the man, seeing not an enemy, but a soul weighed down by regret. "Hate's too heavy a load to carry," he said quietly, his voice steady but kind. "But maybe you can find other ways to serve your community now. That's a start." The lumberyard owner nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief, and within a week, he had begun volunteering his time and resources to build wheelchair ramps for elderly veterans, a small but meaningful step toward earning the respect he had once falsely claimed. Word of Frank's story spread beyond the diner, reaching the local high school, where teachers saw an opportunity to teach their students about true heroism. They invited Frank to speak, and though he was hesitant at first, he agreed, driven by a sense of duty to share what he had learned. As he stood before a room full of teenagers, their eyes wide with curiosity, Frank felt a strange mix of vulnerability and strength. He spoke of service, of sacrifice, of the friends he had lost and the ones who never came home. "The real heroes," he told them, his voice thick with emotion, "are the ones who didn't make it back. I just did my job." But the students saw something more. A man whose quiet courage had shaped a life of integrity. A man who had served without seeking glory. To them, Frank was a living example of what it meant to live with purpose, and his words lingered in their hearts long after he left the stage. The ripple effect of Frank's story reached its peak at North Creek's annual Veterans Day ceremony, an event that had once been a small, sparsely attended affair. This year, it was different. The town came alive with anticipation, and hundreds of people gathered to honor not just Frank, but all who had served. When Frank was asked to be the guest of honor, He was overwhelmed, his heart caught between gratitude and disbelief. "I never needed recognition," he told David as they prepared for the ceremony, his fingers tracing the faded fabric of his old army uniform, now pressed and pristine. "But it feels good to know that service still matters to people." David smiled, adjusting the uniform's collar with care, his own pride shining through. "Dad, your service always mattered," he said softly. "Now people are just finally seeing it." The ceremony was a sea of faces, many holding signs that read, "Thank you, Frank," or "Honor our heroes." The air was thick with emotion, a shared sense of gratitude that bound the community together. But the moment that touched Frank most deeply came when a local artist unveiled a mural on the side of Mabel's diner. It depicted Frank and David standing side by side, father and son, both in uniform, a powerful image of generations united by service and sacrifice. At the base of the mural, in simple, elegant letters, were the words that had become North Creek's unspoken motto: "Honor never gets old." Frank stared at the mural, his throat tight, his heart full. It wasn't just about him. It was about every veteran, every sacrifice, every story that deserved to be remembered. Later, Frank sat on the new veterans' bench outside the diner, a sturdy oak seat installed as a tribute to those who had served. He watched children play in the town square, their laughter mingling with the low murmur of grandparents sharing stories of their own service. David sat beside him, the two of them sharing a quiet moment in the midst of the bustling community. "You know what amazes me?" Frank said, his voice soft but filled with wonder. "What's that, Dad?" David asked, turning to him. Frank's eyes swept over the town that had once overlooked him, but now celebrated his example. "It just took one person standing up to change everything," he said. And in that moment, Frank knew that the legacy of his service and David's unwavering love would live on in North Creek for generations to come. David's arm rested gently on his father's shoulders, a quiet gesture heavy with unspoken love and pride. "That's what heroes do, Dad," he said softly, his voice steady but warm. "They step forward when it counts the most." His words carried a weight that lingered, not just in that moment, but in the hearts of everyone who heard them, a truth that would echo long after the story faded. Frank Wallace was the same man every Saturday morning, sitting in the worn booth of North Creek's diner. His faded army jacket hung loosely on his frame, patched at the elbows from years of wear, a relic of a life that had seen more than most could imagine. His cap, threadbare and tilted slightly, shaded eyes that held a quiet dignity, a kind of strength that didn't demand attention, but commanded it all the same. Frank was a hero, though you wouldn't know it from the way he stirred his coffee, slow and deliberate, or the way he nodded politely to the waitress. His past was woven into the fabric of his being. Medals earned in the chaos of war, lives saved under fire, sacrifices made in places most people only read about. Yet to the world rushing by, he was just an old man, invisible in his routine. What changed that day wasn't Frank himself. It wasn't his jacket, his cap, or the way he carried himself with a humility that bordered on invisibility. What changed was one person's choice, David's choice, to stand up, to speak, to shine a light on a truth too often overlooked. Across America, in diners and coffee shops, on park benches and bus stops, there are countless Frank Wallaces. They wear ordinary clothes that hide purple hearts pinned to their souls. Their hands, now wrinkled and slowed by time, once carried wounded comrades to safety or held the line in battles long forgotten by those who enjoy the freedom they secured. They sit quietly unnoticed as the world moves on, unaware that heroes walk among them, their courage tucked away like an old photograph in a drawer. How often have we been like the college kids in North Creek, quick to judge, to laugh, to dismiss what we don't understand? Their careless words stung Frank, not because his thought their approval, but because they reminded him of a world that had moved on without a backward glance. He'd sit there, sipping his coffee, his thoughts drifting to jungles and deserts, to friends lost and moments of valor that no one seemed to care about anymore. The laughter of those kids cut deeper than they could know, each chuckle a reminder of the 5 years he'd spent believing his service had been forgotten, that his sacrifices had dissolved into the noise of a generation untouched by war. And then there was Julie, the waitress who barely looked up from her notepad as she took Frank's order. She wasn't cruel, just distracted, caught up in her own world of unpaid bills and endless shifts. Julie's mind was a storm of worries. Rent due, a car that wouldn't start, a life that felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She didn't see Frank, not really. To her, he was just another customer, another tip she hoped would be enough to make it through the week. But in her haste, she missed the story sitting right in front of her. She didn't see the man who'd once run through gunfire to save a stranger, who'd carried the weight of war so she could live in peace. Her indifference wasn't malice, but it was a kind of cruelty all the same. A failure to notice the quiet heroism in the man who sat alone. The lumberyard owner was another story entirely. He strutted through North Creek with a chest puffed out by stories he hadn't earned, claiming respect for a service he'd never given. His booming voice filled the diner with tales of battles he'd never fought, medals he'd never touched. To Frank, each word was a theft, not just of valor, but of the recognition he and so many others deserved. The owner's lies weren't just a personal slight. They were a betrayal of every veteran who'd ever worn a uniform, every soldier who'd come home to silence instead of gratitude. Frank's heart ached, not for himself, but for the others like him, whose stories were drowned out by the loud, false bravado of men who'd never known sacrifice. The most insidious lie society tells itself is that heroism is always loud, always dramatic, always draped in capes or celebrated on screens. We expect heroes to look like Hollywood stars, their deeds announced with fanfare and fireworks. But real heroism is often like Frank Wallace, quiet, unassuming, invisible unless you take the time to look closer. It's in the way he carries himself, the way he listens to the world around him, the way he lives with the weight of his past without demanding anyone else carry it for him. Frank didn't need applause. He needed someone to see him, to acknowledge that his life, his service, mattered. David Wallace didn't have superpowers. He wasn't a general or a politician with a platform to command attention. He was just a son, a young man in a uniform that gave him no special authority beyond the respect it symbolized. But David had something rarer than power. He had courage. Not the kind that faces bullets or bombs, but the kind that faces a room full of people and speaks a truth they might not want to hear. When he stood up that Sunday morning, his voice trembling but resolute, he didn't just defend his father. He defended every veteran who'd ever been overlooked, every hero whose story had been buried under the weight of indifference. In less than 5 minutes, David's words shattered the illusion that Frank's service didn't matter. He proved that one voice, one moment of bravery, could change everything. For Frank, those 5 years of silence had been heavy. He'd sat in that diner, week after week, wondering if anyone remembered the cost of freedom. He'd watched the world go by, kids on their phones, couples arguing over trivialities, the lumberyard owner spinning his lies, and he'd feel the ache of being forgotten. But that Sunday, when David stood up, when he spoke of his father's service with pride and defiance, Frank felt something shift. His chest tightened, not with pain, but with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. His service, his sacrifice, his story, they mattered. And in that moment, as David's words hung in the air, Frank allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world hadn't forgotten him after all. The lumberyard owner learned a hard lesson that day. Stolen valor isn't just about wearing a uniform you didn't earn. It's about claiming respect while dismissing those who've paid for it with blood and sweat. His face burned with shame as David's words exposed his lies, not with cruelty, but with the simple, unyielding truth. He'd spent years basking in unearned admiration, but in that moment, he saw himself for what he was, a man who'd taken what wasn't his, while men like Frank sat quietly, their sacrifices ignored. Julie, too, was changed. She stood frozen behind the counter, her notepad forgotten, as David's voice filled the diner. For the first time, she really saw Frank, not as a customer, but as a man with a story, a life, a legacy. Guilt washed over her, not because she'd been unkind, but because she'd been blind. She judged him without knowing him, dismissed him without understanding the weight of his past. In that moment, she vowed to look closer, to listen harder, to see the people around her for who they really were. Everyone has a story, she realized, and to judge without knowing is to wound without reason. But the greatest lesson wasn't just for Julie or the lumberyard owner, it was for all of us. We are surrounded by quiet heroes, men and women whose courage has shaped the world we take for granted. The elderly man in the grocery store, his cart filled with canned soup and memories of Normandy. The woman at the library, her hands turning pages that hold stories of her time as a military nurse. The neighbor who mows his lawn in silence, his mind drifting to lives he saved in places we can't pronounce. They don't ask for our respect, but they deserve it. And our disrespect, our quick judgments, our careless words, can wound them in ways we'll never fully understand. Frank Wallace taught North Creek that honor doesn't demand recognition, but it deserves respect. David taught them that love sometimes means standing up, speaking truth, and refusing to let good people fade into the background. His courage wasn't loud or flashy, it was steady, rooted in a love for his father and a belief that truth matters. He didn't change the world, but he changed one diner, one moment, one man's heart, and that was enough. So here's the challenge. Be the David in your community. Look for the Franks in your world, the quiet heroes hiding in plain sight. When you see an elderly person treated with disrespect, pause and consider the stories they might carry, the courage you'll never comprehend. When someone claims false service, call it out, not with anger, but with the quiet strength of truth. When the crowd laughs at dignity, be the voice that says enough. Because somewhere right now there's a Frank Wallace sitting alone in a diner, wondering if anyone remembers that freedom came at a cost. Don't let him sit alone. Don't let his service be forgotten. And never let anyone mock a uniform without knowing the person who wore it. Type honor if you promise to stand up for veterans who can't stand up for themselves. Share the name of a veteran who deserves recognition. Share this story if you believe real heroes deserve real respect. Your mission is simple but profound. Find the Frank in your community. Be the David who stands up. And in doing so, change everything.